Let me ask you a question that should be simple, but isn't. When was the last time the major powers of the world genuinely cooperated on something that mattered? Not symbolic cooperation, not photo opportunities at summits where leaders shake hands and sign documents that nobody reads. I mean actual cooperation, where competing nations set aside their rivalries because the alternative was worse for everyone. Take your time. Think about it. The answer, if you're being honest, is probably decades ago, and that should terrify you. Because what we are witnessing right now, in real time, across every continent, is not just rising tensions between nations. It is the architecture of a new Cold War, being constructed piece by piece, sanction by sanction, alliance by alliance, and almost nobody is talking about it in those terms. Not yet, but they will. And by the time the term New Cold War becomes common in mainstream media, by the time it's on every news channel and every newspaper front page, it will already be too late to prevent it. The foundations will already be set, the battle lines will already be drawn, and the world will have divided itself into camps that cannot easily be undivided. I wanted to spend the next 15 minutes showing you how we got here, why this is different from anything we've seen before, and why almost nobody, not governments, not militaries, not economies, not societies, is actually prepared for what's coming. This is not speculation, this is pattern recognition, and the patterns are everywhere, once you know what to look for.
The First Cold War never really ended, it just paused. Let's start with some clarity about what a Cold War actually is, because I think the term gets used loosely, and loose thinking leads to bad analysis. A Cold War is not simply great power competition. Great powers have always competed. Rome and Carthage competed. Britain and France competed for centuries. That's just what powerful states do. A Cold War is something more specific. It is a condition where two or more major powers, one, view each other as existential threats, not just rivals, two, organize much of their foreign policy, military spending, and economic strategy around containing or undermining the other. Three, divide the world into spheres of influence and alliance structures that are often mutually exclusive. And four, avoid direct military conflict precisely because the cost would be catastrophic, but engage in every other form of competition, economic, technological, ideological, and proxy warfare. That was the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, from roughly 1947 to 1991. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the dominant narrative in the West was simple: we won. Liberal democracy triumphed, the free market triumphed. History, in Francis Fukuyama's famous phrase, had ended. There would be no more grand ideological struggles, just the gradual, inevitable spread of democratic capitalism across the globe. That narrative was comforting. It was also completely wrong. What actually happened was not the end of history. It was an intermission, a 20-year period, roughly from 1991 to 2008. Where American power was so overwhelming, so uncontested, that it created the illusion of permanence. The illusion that unipolarity, one superpower dominating the globe, was the natural order of things. But unipolarity is not natural. It is rare, it is temporary, and it was already starting to crack by the mid-2000s. Though most Western analysts were too invested in the triumphalist narrative to notice. Russia under Vladimir Putin was rebuilding. Not back to Soviet levels, but enough to matter, enough to reassert influence in its near abroad, enough to challenge Western expansion into what Moscow considered its sphere of influence. China under Hu Jintao and then Xi Jinping was not just growing economically, it was translating that economic growth into military capacity, technological sophistication, and geopolitical ambition. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, was not just an infrastructure project. It was a blueprint for reshaping global trade routes and influence patterns outside of Western-dominated institutions. And critically, both Russia and China began to see the United States not as a partner in a rules-based international order, but as the primary obstacle to their own rise. This is the shift. This is where the new Cold War actually begins. Not with a dramatic event, like the fall of the Berlin Wall in reverse, but with a slow, grinding reorientation of how major powers see each other and organize themselves in response. The Ukraine war, which began in 2014 with Crimea and escalated catastrophically in 2022, is not the cause of the new Cold War. It is a symptom. It is what happens when spheres of influence collide and neither side is willing to back down. The same is true of the Taiwan situation. The same is true of the South China Sea. The same is true of the technology wars over semiconductors, over 5G, over artificial intelligence. These are not isolated disputes. These are fronts in a larger confrontation that most people don't yet recognize as a unified phenomenon. But it is, and it's accelerating.
Why this Cold War is different and more dangerous now. Some of you are thinking, okay, fine, great power competition is back, but we survived the first Cold War. Why is this one worse? Fair question. Let me give you 3 reasons why the new Cold War is structurally more dangerous than the old one. First, nuclear proliferation. During the first Cold War, there were 2 primary nuclear powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain, France, and China had arsenals, but they were far smaller. The logic of deterrence, mutually assured destruction, was terrifying, but relatively simple. 2 scorpions in a bottle. Neither could strike without being destroyed in return. Today, there are 9 confirmed nuclear powers, and several more threshold states, countries that could develop nuclear weapons within months if they chose to. Iran is the obvious example. South Korea is quietly moving in that direction. Japan could do it within a year, if the political decision were made. The more nuclear powers there are, the more complex deterrence becomes, the more opportunities for miscalculation, the more scenarios where a regional conflict could spiral into something much, much worse. And unlike the first Cold War, where there were direct communication channels between Washington and Moscow, hotlines, summits, treaties, the current environment has far less institutional infrastructure for managing crises. The arms control treaties that took decades to negotiate are being abandoned. The INF Treaty, gone. Open skies, gone. New START is hanging by a thread. We are entering an era of nuclear multipolarity, with fewer rules, less communication, and more potential flashpoints than at any time since 1945. Second, economic interdependence. This one is counterintuitive. Many people assume that economic interdependence prevents conflict. The logic is simple. If our economies are intertwined, we have too much to lose from fighting each other. That was the argument before World War I. Europe in 1914 was deeply economically integrated. Germany and Britain were major trading partners. That didn't stop them from slaughtering each other for 4 years. Economic interdependence does not prevent war. What it does is make the decision to go to war economically catastrophic. And sometimes catastrophic costs are accepted anyway when the political stakes are high enough. Today, the global economy is more integrated than it was in 1914 or even in 1947. China is the largest trading partner of over 120 countries. The supply chains for everything from smartphones to pharmaceuticals to automobiles are spread across dozens of countries. If the world divides into hard blocks, American-led and Chinese-led, the economic disruption will be staggering. And unlike the first Cold War, where the Soviet and Western economies were largely separate, the decoupling process this time will be wrenching, expensive, and politically destabilizing. We are already seeing the beginning of this. Export controls on semiconductors, restrictions on Chinese technology companies, the push to reshore manufacturing, the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions. Each of these measures makes sense individually, but collectively they are building a wall down the middle of the global economy. And walls, once built, are very hard to take down. Third, the absence of ideology. This might sound strange, but hear me out. The first Cold War was, at its core, an ideological struggle. Democracy versus communism, capitalism versus central planning, individual freedom versus collective organization. Those ideologies were real. They shaped how people lived, how governments functioned, how societies were organized. And because they were ideological, there was always the possibility, however distant, of conversion. The possibility that one side might convince the other, or that internal contradictions might cause one system to collapse, which is eventually what happened to the Soviet Union. The new Cold War is not primarily ideological. It is civilizational and nationalist. China is not trying to export communism. Russia is not trying to spread Soviet-style governance. What they are asserting is the right to their own sphere of influence, the right to organize their regions according to their own interests, and the rejection of a world order where Western powers, particularly the United States, set the rules unilaterally. This is harder to resolve than ideological conflict, because there is no conversion. There is no winning the argument. There is only the brute fact of competing interests and the question of who has the power to enforce their vision. When the conflict is about identity, about sovereignty, about historical grievances and national pride, compromise becomes almost impossible, because compromise feels like humiliation, and no major power will accept sustained humiliation. This is why the current trajectory is so dangerous. There is no off-ramp, no ideological shift that resolves the tension, only the grinding question of which side will blink first. And increasingly, the answer is neither. The alliances are forming, and they're not what you think. One of the clearest signs that we are in a new Cold War is the reformation of alliance structures. But unlike the first Cold War, where the lines were clear, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, the new alignments are more fluid, more transactional, and in some ways more dangerous because they're less predictable. Let's start with the obvious ones. The Western Bloc, the United States, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia. This is the continuation of the old Cold War architecture, now being reactivated and expanded. AUKUS, the security pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, is explicitly designed to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad, the US, Japan, India, and Australia, same purpose. NATO, which was supposed to become obsolete after the Soviet collapse, is now more unified than it has been in decades, precisely because of the Russian threat. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral, have joined. NATO's focus is shifting eastward, and increasingly toward the Indo-Pacific as well. The Eurasian bloc, Russia, China, and an expanding constellation of states that are either aligned with them or hedging their bets. Iran is the most obvious member, North Korea, Belarus, increasingly parts of Central Asia. But the really interesting development is how many countries are playing both sides. India, for example, is part of the Quad, but also a major buyer of Russian oil and weapons. It participates in BRICS alongside China and Russia. Turkey is a NATO member, but buys Russian missile systems and plays a balancing game between Moscow and Washington. Saudi Arabia, historically a key American ally, is now engaging with China, Russia, and Iran in ways that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. This is not your grandfather's Cold War, where you were either with us or against us. This is a more complex, multipolar environment, where many countries are trying to maximize their autonomy by playing major powers off each other. Which sounds smart, but it's also incredibly unstable. Because when a crisis comes, when these countries are forced to choose, the choices they make will reshape the entire global order. And we don't know which way most of them will go. The most important relationship in this new Cold War is the one between Russia and China. These are two authoritarian states with a long history of mutual suspicion. They fought border wars in the 1960s. They have competing interests in Central Asia. They are not natural allies. But they have a shared enemy, or more precisely, a shared resentment of American dominance. And that resentment has been enough to drive a convergence that is remarkable in its speed and depth. China is now Russia's largest trading partner. Chinese firms are helping Russia evade sanctions. Russia is supplying China with energy at discounted rates. They conduct joint military exercises. They coordinate at the UN Security Council. They are building, if not a formal alliance, then something that functions very much like one. And from a Western perspective, this is a nightmare scenario, because it means the two largest authoritarian powers are working together, not perfectly, not without friction, but enough to counterbalance Western pressure in ways that neither could alone. If Russia and China hold together, if that partnership deepens rather than fractures, then the new Cold War is not a contest between one superpower and a collection of smaller states. It's a genuine bipolar struggle. And that changes everything.
Nobody is ready, and that's the scariest part. So we've established that a new Cold War is forming. We've established that it's different from the first one in ways that make it more dangerous. We've established that alliances are forming, and technology is the battlefield. Now, let me tell you why almost nobody is prepared for this. First, public awareness is almost non-existent. Ask the average person in any Western country if they think we're in a new Cold War. Most will say no, or they'll say maybe, or they'll say, I haven't really thought about it. That's not their fault. The shift has been gradual. There was no single Pearl Harbor moment, no Berlin Wall moment, no 9/11 moment that crystallized everything. It's been a slow accumulation of tensions that individually seem manageable, but collectively represent a fundamental reordering of global politics. And because there's no clear narrative, no single enemy that can be easily defined and vilified, it doesn't have the psychological salience that the first Cold War had. But that lack of awareness is dangerous because societies that don't understand the environment they're in make bad decisions. They aren't prepared for sacrifices. They aren't ready for disruptions. And when the crisis comes, and it will come, the shock will be far greater than it needs to be. Second, military readiness is questionable. Western militaries, particularly in Europe, have spent the last 30 years downsizing, outsourcing, and focusing on counterterrorism and expeditionary warfare. They are not structured or equipped for large-scale conventional conflict with a peer adversary. Ammunition stockpiles are low. Production capacity is limited. Defense industrial bases have atrophied. As we saw in the Ukraine war, Western countries struggled to supply Ukraine with enough artillery shells, enough air defense missiles, enough basic munitions, and Ukraine is just one country. If a broader conflict broke out, if multiple fronts opened simultaneously, NATO's ability to sustain a prolonged conventional war is genuinely in question. Russia and China, by contrast, have spent the last 15 years modernizing their militaries, specifically for conflict with the West. They have invested in anti-access/area denial systems, in hypersonic missiles, in cyber capabilities, in electronic warfare. They are not preparing for counterinsurgency. They are preparing for great power war. The readiness gap is real, and it's closing in the wrong direction. Third, economic vulnerability is profound. Western economies, particularly in Europe, are deeply dependent on global supply chains that run through potential adversary states. Rare earth minerals from China, pharmaceuticals, with key ingredients sourced from China, energy, until very recently, from Russia. If the world bifurcates into hard blocks, the economic pain will be severe. Inflation will spike, supply chains will break, industries will be disrupted, and the political pressure to back down, to compromise, to avoid the economic cost will be enormous. China knows this, which is why it has spent 2 decades building leverage through economic integration. Belt and Road is not just about infrastructure, it's about creating dependencies, making countries economically reliant on China so that when the political pressure comes, they have no choice but to accommodate. And it's working. Look at how many countries refuse to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Look at how many African, Asian, and Latin American countries are hedging, refusing to pick sides. That's not neutrality. That's economic calculation. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, there is no shared understanding of what victory looks like. In the first Cold War, the goal was containment. Stop the spread of communism. Wait for internal contradictions to bring down the Soviet system. That was the strategy. It was clear. It was patient. And ultimately, it worked. What is the strategy now? Contain China? China's economy is already larger than America's in purchasing power parity terms. It's the largest trading partner of most countries. Containment, in the traditional sense, is not possible. Regime change, that's a fantasy. The Chinese Communist Party is not the Soviet Politburo. It has delivered sustained economic growth for 40 years. It has widespread, if not universal, legitimacy within China. It is not going to collapse from internal contradictions anytime soon. Coexistence, that requires mutual respect for spheres of influence, acceptance of a multipolar world, willingness to compromise. And right now, neither Washington nor Beijing seems willing to accept the other's terms. So we are drifting into a confrontation without a clear theory of victory, without a clear off-ramp, without a clear sense of what the end state is supposed to look like. That is dangerous because conflicts without clear goals tend to escalate. They tend to become about credibility, about not looking weak, about honor and prestige rather than concrete interests. And those are the conflicts that spiral out of control. What happens next and what we should be watching. So if I'm right, if we are entering a new Cold War and nobody is ready, what happens next? I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you what the structural logic suggests, and I can tell you what the warning signs are. First, expect more proxy conflicts. Just like the First Cold War, direct conflict between major powers is too dangerous. But proxy conflicts, wars fought by allies and clients of the major powers, those are inevitable. Ukraine is the obvious example. Taiwan could be next, the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, the Middle East, where American and Chinese and Russian interests all intersect. Proxy wars allow major powers to bleed each other, to test each other's resolve, to gain strategic advantages without crossing the nuclear threshold. They are horrible for the people living in those regions, but from a great power perspective, they are useful. Expect more of them. Second, expect economic decoupling to accelerate. The era of hyperglobalization is over. The era of managed decoupling, or de-risking as Western governments prefer to call it, is here. Supply chains will be restructured, trade will be weaponized, technology will be controlled. This will make everything more expensive. It will slow global growth. It will increase inflation, but it will happen anyway, because national security will trump economic efficiency. Watch for more export controls, more sanctions, more restrictions on investment, more pressure on countries to choose sides. The world is being rewired, and the process will be painful. Third, expect an arms race, not just in nuclear weapons, though that too, but in every domain: space, cyber, AI, hypersonics, drones, directed energy weapons. Military spending is going to rise in the United States, in China, in Europe, in Japan, in India, everywhere, because once the arms race dynamic kicks in, it's very hard to stop. Each side's buildup justifies the other side's buildup. And the spiral continues. This will divert resources from everything else, from infrastructure, from education, from healthcare, from addressing climate change. The opportunity cost of the new Cold War will be staggering. Fourth, expect internal political pressure to intensify. Cold wars are not just external. They shape domestic politics. They empower hawks. They marginalize moderates. They create pressure for conformity, for loyalty, for us versus them thinking. We're already seeing this. In China, Xi Jinping has consolidated power to a degree not seen since Mao. Dissent is crushed. Nationalism is stoked. In Russia, Putin has turned the country into a garrison state. Opposition is criminalized. Independent media is gone. In the West, the pressure is more subtle, but it's there. The push to restrict Chinese technology, the scrutiny of academic exchanges, the revival of McCarthyist rhetoric about who is soft on China. Cold wars make societies less open, less tolerant, more paranoid. That's not a bug. It's a feature, and it will get worse before it gets better. Now let's talk about conclusion. The world we're entering and the choice we don't have. Let me bring this to a close. I titled this, "The World is Entering a New Cold War and Nobody is Ready." I've spent the last 15 minutes showing you why I believe that's true. The structural conditions are there, the alliances are forming, the technology race is accelerating, the proxies are being armed, the decoupling is happening, and the readiness, the psychological, the military, the economic readiness for what this means is almost entirely absent. The tragedy is that this is not inevitable. Nothing in history is truly inevitable. Human beings make choices, leaders make choices, societies make choices. But the choices that would prevent this, genuine arms control agreements, mutual respect for spheres of influence, a willingness to share power rather than dominate, those choices require a level of wisdom, humility, and long-term thinking that is almost entirely absent from our current political leadership on all sides. So the default path, the path of least resistance, is continued escalation, continued hardening of positions, continued buildup of capabilities, continued division of the world into camps. And at some point, probably within the next decade, we will look back and realize that the decision point, the moment when a different path was still possible, has passed. We're not there yet, but we're close. So what do I want you to take from this? Not despair. Despair is useless. What I want you to take is clarity. The clarity to see the world as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. The clarity to recognize the patterns before they become crises. The clarity to understand that the comfortable assumptions of the post-Cold War era, the assumptions about inevitable progress, about the end of great power conflict, about the triumph of liberal democracy, those assumptions are dead. We are entering a different world, a harder world, a more dangerous world. And the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we stop pretending otherwise, the better chance we have of navigating it without catastrophe. The new Cold War is here. The only question now is whether we're smart enough to manage it or whether we'll sleepwalk into something far worse. Thank you for watching, and please hit the subscribe button.